back and wait for YouTube to confirm that it's going to work. Well, Zoom and YouTube. When it doesn't work, I'm not sure which one to blame, but we'll find out. Hopefully it's going to work. So far, the signs are good. And there we are. Look at that. Sometimes it just works. And change that so I can see it better. Put that over there. And move our Zoom participants into place. Okay. It's one of those things where I wish there was one button that would just do, the 4 or 5 little steps that are all needed. Just the same thing each time, just click and it would take care of it. But I still am grateful for the fact that we have the technology at all. So not exactly a huge problem. So it's good to see everyone and to be seen by those of you who are not on Zoom but are on YouTube. It's been a couple of weeks because of Pesach, but it is time to get back to resume our Torah study from where we are in the weekly cycle. You may wonder, why don't we just resume what we missed and what the holiday interrupted? And I've considered that at other times, but the problem is that then you become out of sync with the weekly parasha cycle. And while there's no tragedy with that, and I highly recommend that you read whatever part of the Torah or Tanakh you want to read anytime you feel like it, there is something to be said for staying in tune with that weekly cycle of being synchronized with the rest of the Jewish world and trying to study in the same way that they are studying. So we're going to stick with what everyone else is doing, and we'll just have to keep lapping it multiple years, and anything that we missed this year we'll pick up next year, or we may have already if you want to check the back catalog. So we're picking up now in chapter 12 in Parashat Tazria. Technically today is a double parasha of Tazria Metzora, although I can guarantee we're not going to make it to Metzora because that's just not the speed that we move at. Now, Tazria and Metzora are going to discuss some very unusual, distant, unfamiliar, hard to relate to type topics. We are really coming into some of the heavier purity legislation. So I have to give my standard disclaimer for this topic right here at the outset, that when we are talking about ritual purity or impurity of something being tahor or something being tameh, that we are not talking about physical filth. This is not about being covered in mud or covered in farm animal droppings. This is a spiritual status. We are not talking about hygiene. This is not early germ discussion. And that's going to become especially important when we get to chapter 13 in just a few minutes. So keep in mind that when we're talking about things that are tameh and tahor, things that are ritually impure or ritually pure, that this is not a value judgment. This is not a critique. This is simply a descriptive process for assessing a status of a person in their relationship with things that require ritual purity. The most notable, of course, being the temple sacrifices and the things that are produced through the sacrificial services. So try to read through this without a nagging judgmental voice. Unfortunately, for a variety of both sociological and marketing reasons, the words pure and impure, clean and unclean in modern American English have very strong connotations of good and bad, and you need to unlearn that. As my favorite example that I've tried to mention many times, we are required to become ritually impure sometimes, most importantly for the taking care of a deceased person. And that is a huge, huge mitzvah to do. So this is not something that is dirty or wrong. This is something that simply happens. And that is going to be our segue into chapter 12 here, where we see one of the most common things that simply happens. It's actually pretty complex and a miracle, but it is something that happens all the time. And indeed, without it, we wouldn't be here. And that is childbirth. So let's take a look at chapter 12 here. and see how this is going to unfold with our Rashi on the right and our Rashbam on the left. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, a woman, when she produces seed and bears a male, she remains tameh, that is to say, ritually impure, for 7 days. Like the days of her infirmity of being apart, she shall remain tameh." Again, Fox here in his translation is avoiding the word pure or impure, clean or unclean. Just a quick reminder, and I'll try not to have to say this too often, tameh is the word that usually gets translated as ritually impure or ritually unclean, and tahor is the word that is usually translated as being ritually clean or ritually pure. So before we get into any more of this, just a little bit about Hebrew idiomatic expression. You may see this phrase here, and indeed the phrase from which the entire Torah portion gets its name, that when she produces seed. This is the colloquial language of the biblical times, of how people mentally created an analogy of what childbirth was like, that there was a seed from the husband, which was fairly obvious, and that there was a seed from the mother, which in those days of pre-scientific investigation was much less obvious. So when we see here that she is producing seed, what it means is that she conceived. She became pregnant at that time, and her seed and that of her husband combined to create the child. Okay, so enough. Oh, I'm sorry. One more thing that also does bear a little idiomatic translation, that infirmity of her being apart, nidat dota. This is, again, using the concept of nida, which is the separation because of ritual impurity that happens according to the monthly cycle of women. This is being used as a comparison, that there is a similar status during this time as that which she undergoes during a usual monthly cycle. Okay, hopefully that's enough of the basic information. We'll leave deeper explanations to our commentary. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin is to be circumcised. From 30 days and 3 days, she is to stay in her period of blood purification. Any holy thing she is not to touch, and the holy area she is not to enter, until fulfilling the days of purification. We're going to have to go into our commentary for that, so I'm going to leave it as it stands at the moment. Now, if it is a female that she bears, she remains tameh for 2 weeks, like her time of discharge, like that nida that we talked about earlier, and for 60 days and 6 days, she is to stay for a period of blood purification. So right off the bat, we can see that there is a difference here. And if you notice, the math is that there is a 7-day period followed by a 33-day period for a boy, and there is a 14-day period followed by a 66-day period for a girl. Literally double for the girl or half for the boy, whichever one you want to begin with as being your baseline. Again, commentary is coming up. And at the fulfilling of the days of her purification, for a son or for a daughter, she is to bring a lamb in its first year as an offering up, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove as a chatat offering. Chatat offerings are often translated as sin offerings, to the entrance of the tent of appointment to the priest. He is to bring it, in this case the priest, bring it near before the presence of Adonai, and is to effect purgation for her, atonement. And she will be purified from her source of blood. This is the instruction regarding one giving birth, whether to a male or to a female. But if her hand does not find enough for a sheep, meaning if she is not wealthy enough, she is to take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one for an offering up and one for a chatat offering, when the priest effects purgation for her. Then she is pure. Okay, hopefully you find that moderately confusing. It is not a topic within the Torah that gets a lot of attention in modern days. We do not have the same Torah cycle, the same sacrificial cycle, because we don't have the altar, and we, of course, are not able to therefore be able to differentiate, to distinguish these different zones in the same relative connection to that ritual at the temple. But there is still a lot that we need to understand. There is much in here that is still of great insight. So let us go ahead and begin. And we're going to begin with Rashbam over here on the left, and we'll bounce back and forth as well as best suits the commentary. So the one that becomes pregnant, the one who gives seed, who becomes pregnant, whether with a male or female fetus. When the time comes for her to give birth, the sex of the baby determines her status as to the impurity known as her impurity of birth. All the details are spelled out in the verses following. So in typical Rashbam fashion, he gives us a nice summary that's just trying to point out a couple of interesting things. One, that once a person conceives, then we are already into the path for this impurity at the far end, and that it will be up to the gender of the child once born to determine the precise length of that. Rashi has a similar topic over here in his first comment. Rav Simlai said, even as the formation of man took place after that of every cattle, beast, and fowl when the world was created, so too the law regarding him is set forth after the law regarding cattle, beast, and fowl, which was contained in the previous chapter. All right, so immediately we can see a difference between Rashi, which, as I mentioned before, although he is trying to give a pashat, a straightforward interpretation, will also bring many of the more midrashic interpretations of the comments of our sages. And here, rather than doing what Rashbam did, which was give us a simple summary of, yes, this is what happens when someone conceives and then the child is born, Rashi wants to tell us about the order of this section of the Torah. If we go back into chapter 11, we will find the laws of kashrut. And those laws, of course, deal with the beasts of the land, cattle, beast, and fowl, as he puts it. And since we were created after them, we are placed in the Torah after them for this discussion. Now, as always, you have to first ask, well, what was Rashi addressing when he had this? And the simple answer would be, well, Rashi is saying, you might have thought that the discussion of human children and human conditions would be more important and thus take priority over a discussion of what humans eat, kashrut. But this is why this discussion comes after kashrut, because it is simply following the pattern, the order that the elements were created in. Since God began with the animals, the Torah begins with animals. When God then moved after those animals to talk about humans, the Torah now moves to talk about humans. So it is a sort of straightforward explanation to the question you maybe never had. And again, one of the greatest benefits of going through Jewish commentary is that it teaches us to ask questions that we hadn't asked before, and that attunes us to be able to ask questions of the world around us. I've always said that if only we could teach critical thinking through just rigorous reading of Torah commentary, people would be much less gullible in the rest of their life. Rashi then continues, though, on that word of, and she produces seed. These words are superfluous, meaning that we don't really need to have it, because, and she gave birth, she bore a child, would suffice. They mean literally if she brings forth seed, and are employed to include the case that if she gave birth to him, the male child, as a pulpy mass which had dissolved, having become liquefied like seed, even then its mother becomes unclean, as though it were a normal birth. So what Rashi is introducing us to, and which the Mishnah and the Talmud go into much more detail about, is that this phrase, and she produces seed, is trying to remind us that even in the case of certain types of miscarriages, where the child is no longer fully formed for a late-term miscarriage that has gone very awry, or in the case of a stillbirth, that the condition described here of the ritual impurity still is relevant, it still applies. And had the words "she produces seed" not been there, then you might have thought that it only applied if the child was born as a fully formed and healthy child. But no, because it mentions the seed specifically, even if the child, the fetus, has reverted to a completely dissolved mass due to a tragic failure somewhere in the process of gestation, nonetheless, there are many more rules, but nonetheless, in general, there is still, these rules are still applicable with regards to everything else here in chapter 12. Does that make sense? Everybody understands? Okay, let's go ahead and continue with Rashi. As in the days of her separation, that moment of that time of nida, for her impurity shall she become unclean. According to the regulation of every uncleanness which is mentioned in the case of a nida, a woman during her monthly cycle, does she become unclean in respect to the uncleanness resulting from childbirth, even though the womb opened without any issue of blood. So the phrase of nida here is being told to us not just as a vague comparison or analogy, but to remind us that all of the general rules of nida will also apply for the woman during this time period. In this case, since it's the boy, for 7 days. For the girl, that'll be 14 days. So that reference to nida is not just a casual reference. It has specific information coded within its reference. And then Rashi goes on to explain this phrase, dota. This is an expression of anything which flows from her body. And the translation is, as in the days of the separation due to her flux. Most of us don't use the word flux anymore in modern English, but here it is again talking about a flow or a discharge from the body. Another explanation is it has the same meaning as this other word for malady or sickness. And this is the term for her sickness, because no woman sees an issue of blood from herself, except that as a result of it, she becomes unwell and her head and limbs feel heavy. So Rashi here is quoting in the second half of this comment from the Talmud in Nida, talking about the idea that this outflow of blood, this discharge from the body, is always a signal of a certain unhealthiness in the woman. Now, we have to make a few allowances for both Rashi as well as for Talmud and earlier strains of rabbinic talking, because while they are certainly capable to analyze and understand and apply the halacha that is being described here in the Torah, some of their attributions to medical conditions is incomplete or based upon faulty assumptions. So the idea that every discharge is due to an imbalance within the body, something that produces this heaviness of head and limbs, is not something that, biologically speaking, we would believe in the modern world. That doesn't change the underlying halacha, which is based upon the specific words, not upon the secondary explanations. So it's an important principle to keep in mind whenever going through any part of Torah and then reading commentary, that the commentary that tries to outline precisely what it is we do based upon the wording of the Torah and the transmission of the oral Torah is something that is enduring and clear, but the secondary levels of explanation or pseudo-scientific understanding is something that indeed can be wrong in different places within our commentary. Excuse me. You'll notice, of course, that I'm very carefully not saying the Torah is wrong, because you'll notice the Torah doesn't say exactly what Rashi said. That is an explanation that he provides based upon the Talmud, but it is an explanation that was of their decision, not built into the Torah itself. Very important distinction to keep in mind. Excuse me, just a second. All right. Back over in Rashbam, he has some points to make on this topic as well. So first of all, he goes back to this idea of the separation for 7 days. And he says, even if it was a dry birth, meaning no blood emerged from the vagina, the same way that Rashi, let me scroll back up, in his comment here, talks about even if the womb opened without any issue of blood. Both of them are referencing halacha, that this idea is that it is going to be like this separation, even if there isn't actually a discharge of blood at the time. The underlying idea being that there cannot be a birth without some level of bleeding, and even if it's not visible to the naked eye, it is still something that is there. And as Rashbam continues, just as the red color of the blood determines if a menstruating woman is still evacuating blood, so the same criteria apply to a woman giving birth. The whitish fluid that is characteristic of a woman in a state of flux, the non-nida situation, another source of ritual impurity originating within her body, is irrelevant to the subject under discussion in our verses. He continues, this idea of nida, this expression denotes a type of isolation, a distance from her husband. This doesn't necessarily mean isolation and physically, but during that time in the monthly cycle, there is a physical separation, meaning that no intimacy between the husband and wife during that time. And then this last idea of this infirmity, this is an expression denoting a kind of sickness. So we could certainly see this as being that during that time that she is often in poor health. And indeed, as much as, and unfortunately, as many people take birth for granted in the modern world, historically, birth has been an incredibly dangerous, difficult, and often sickness-inducing time during a woman's life. It was one of the most dangerous things that a woman could do, and still is one of the more dangerous things that a woman can experience. And the Torah seems to be indicating that indeed, for this period immediately after birth, there is a window of difficulty that is normal for a woman recovering from birth. Questions or comments as we continue here? Okay. Let me just get this lined up with verse 4 so that we can see what our commentaries are talking about. Let's go ahead and start with Rashbam on the left, who has only one thing to say about this verse. So this is talking about the blood of purification. Blood, which is not the result of menstruation. There are two separate origins within a woman's body from which blood emerges at different times. The blood which emerges during the 33 days mentioned does not confer impurity. In fact, it is part of the healing process. So what Rashbam is trying to let us know is that, yes, there is going to be a period after the 7 days when she is considered ritually impure, but there's going to be these 33 days, and it is very likely that there will still be signs of bleeding as she continues to recover from her pregnancy. But what does that mean? Well, during that time period, that blood is not considered to be a sign of ritual impurity. So she moves into a different status. There are still limitations, as we can see, and as we'll talk about more in just a second, but she is not in the same level as the nida status that we looked at in our earlier verse. So the 7 followed by 33 really does demarcate two different statuses for her. In the first one, she is in a state of ritual impurity, and in the second one, she is in a in-between state where she is mostly ritually pure, but there are still limitations with regards to the Holy of Holies or sacrifices and things like that. And then Rashi on the other side, we're going to skip his first one, which is just a straight linguistic discussion for vocabulary, and pick up with the comparable one regarding this blood of purification. Even though she sees an issue of blood, she is nevertheless clean. Again, as Rashbam explained, that during this 33 days, any signs of blood are not considered to be ritually impure. Now, why not? Well, the Torah itself does not make it clear. Rashbam is offering an explanation that there might be two sources of blood, one source which releases blood and renders her ritually impure, and another source which releases blood, which does not render her impure. Other commentaries, which I don't have here on our page because I'm still trying to keep this simple, say, no, it's simply a matter of God says. If God says this blood renders somebody impure, then it renders them impure. And if God says the blood that comes from the same place but at a different time does not render you impure, then it doesn't render you impure. And that there isn't a biological reason underlying why this and why not that. Indeed, we see that for many aspects of Jewish life. There are things that we are commanded to do on a day-to-day basis. And then there are the same things that we are commanded not to do at special times. So if it comes to eating leavened bread, it is both normal and regular for us to do that on any given day, except during Pesach, when all of a sudden it becomes forbidden. And then afterwards, it becomes perfectly fine again. It is nothing changing about the bread per se. It is our relationship to it according to the command of God to follow during certain parts of the calendar, certain times. Here we see that being applied on a more individual basis. So let's continue with our Rashi. We're not going to look at his discussion of Mapik. I love grammar and it's fascinating, but we'd have to cover a lot more background before we could understand what he's describing there. It's just having to do with how the nikudot, the dots, are applied to certain words. And then coming back to our idea of things that she can or cannot touch, she shall not touch anything that is holy, meaning not anything. This serves to include the heave offering, the truma. The Torah prescribes this because such a woman must be regarded as one who has taken immersion on a very long day, because she immersed herself at the end of the first of 7 days, whilst her sun does not set to bring about her purification until sunset of the 40th day, since it is only on the morrow that she has to bring the atonement offering in connection with her purification. So what this is trying to bring, help us understand, is that in many other cases, a person who is ritually impure will go to the mikveh, and then on the end of the day that they went to the mikveh, they will then be considered ritually impure. So if you go to the mikveh, in the morning, you are now ritually pure, but you're not able to partake of things that require ritual purity until that same day on which you went to the mikveh has finally finished, and you're now into the night of the new day. This idea of being sort of half pure and not completely pure is used in many different circumstances. Here, what Rashi is explaining is that when she goes to the mikveh following the 7 days, that initial period of separation where she is considered ritually impure, that she now becomes as though she were any other person who had gone to the mikveh for a different type of impurity that would eventually be allowed to partake of holy things following the end of the day. She is like someone who has a really, really long day. Indeed, she's got 33 days to wait. So she's in that same in-between status where she is ritually pure in the sense that she can still associate and be intimate and all the other things that are normal, but she is still waiting for the clock to run out on the initial purification process so that she'll be able to actually have things that are needing ritual purity, like truma or from the sacrifices themselves. And then, as he points out in his final comment on this verse, she shall not touch. This is a prohibition addressed to anyone who would eat holy things in a state of uncleanness, meaning that this statement that she cannot eat things or not touch things while she is ritually impure is not only aimed at her. This is a prohibition that we can learn that applies to everyone who is in a similar state of ritual impurity. So that is just one of those little ways that we get a glimpse into the long-term implications of the text for situations beyond the narrow confines here of postpartum impurity. Questions before we move to verse 7, where we talk about our excuse me, where we talk about the effects that happens when she's actually come to the temple, or Mishkan in this case. All right, let's get them loaded up or lined up, and let me take another drink. Must still have a frog from Pesach stuck in my throat. All right, so, and then she will be pure. That's the text that Rashbam is building off of. She is ritually pure enough to be allowed to eat sacred foods. This is the interpretation of our sages in Yevamot, and this is not so surprising. As a person undergoing the ritual rehabilitation process, if lacking only the official stamp of atonement, meaning the sacrifice in question, may already eat sacred foods of the sanctity level of truma, grain or its derivative given to the priest as a tithe. Sacred foods of a higher degree of sanctity may not be consumed by such a person until he has brought the requisite sacrifice. So pointing out that we have these two different sacrifices, one that is the general sacrifice and the other being the chatat. He is trying to explain how that is possible when she is not yet fully recovered from her ritual impurity. She is 80-90% of the way there, but she is still like this person waiting out the long day. So how is she able to be involved? As he explains, this is fine because she is like someone who is just waiting for that official stamp of atonement, the final step, but everything else has already been done correctly. Then yes, she is able to eat from things or touch things that are of that secondary level. And then once that final chatat offering is taken care of and the kapara is finished, then of course she is returned to the normal state in 100%. And Rashi, of course, will bring us through a similar idea. Two offerings have been mentioned, a lamb and a bird, but it states here, and he shall offer it and so make atonement for her. This teaches you that only the omission to sacrifice a particular one of these two precludes her from eating the sacrificial food. And which is this? It is the sin offering, because it is stated immediately afterwards, he shall make expiation for her and she shall be clean. That which is intended as expiation, which is the sin offering, the chatat offering, upon it does the purification depend. So Rashi goes into more detail than Rashbam did to try and explain the difference between the two different sacrifices, and explaining that by this shift from a plural vow or plural verb that she is offering them, because we have this lamb plus a dove, so plural happening there, and then moving to a singular that it is being offered and it is then making atonement. That is showing us that there is only one of them truly required for the actual purification process. And since it is the one that is connected to kapara, to purgation, then it must be the chatat offering that is the one that is the focus. Make sense? All right, and then she shall be clean. It follows, therefore, that until she had brought the atonement offering, she is termed unclean, although she is actually tahara. She actually is clean. So again, we're seeing that this is an odd period where she is classified technically as ritually impure, because otherwise she could not become ritually pure at this point, but she is treated as being ritually pure for all except for these last sacrificial type issues. Okay. Any questions before we finish off with verse 8 from Rashi, and then we get into something even more complicated? Okay, so with verse 8, finishing up our whole discussion of the impurity following birth, the one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering, meaning these two doves that she can bring rather than the sheep and the dove if she is not able to afford that. Scripture puts it, meaning the olah, the non-chatat offering, first only by way of mention. But so far as offering it is concerned, the sin offering precedes the burnt offering. Thus do we learn in Masechet Zvachim in the Talmud in the chapter there referenced. So he's trying to just draw our attention that yes, we might mention the olah first, That's the offering up in Fox's translation. But that doesn't mean that the Olah is offered first. That we would naturally offer the Chatat first, because that is the one that creates the final state of purification, and thus she is then able to partake of the Olah perfectly fine, with no residual impurity still being a problem. Just a good reminder from Rashi that just because something came in a particular order in the Torah does not mean that we have to believe that it's supposed to be done in precisely that order. Sometimes we have to apply logic, and we have to apply a relative insight from other parts of the text in order to understand precisely what should be done. Again, as I always say, this is partly what prevents people from just opening up the Torah and living a biblical life. It doesn't work like that. As much as people want it to, I'm afraid it does take a lot of time, effort, study, debate, discussion, research, reformulation, and doing all of that multiple times for multiple topics. And that's a good thing. That makes us a stronger person. It makes our faith stronger. It makes our community stronger. So hopefully that's not too annoying to everyone. All right. Chapter 13 is going to introduce us to the idea of Tzara'at. Now, Tzara'at, as you can see from Fox's translation, is going to remain untranslated, because translating it into the word leprosy is very problematic. Leprosy and Tzara'at are not the same thing. They share many features. They can seem very similar in some aspects, but it doesn't work. And before we actually even get into our Torah text, I want to start off with Rashbam's first comment over here, because I hope that that will help us understand why we're not calling this leprosy. None of the verses in the chapters following may be interpreted in the way they sound when read superficially, as the phenomenon described do not correspond to any skin diseases we are familiar with and are not subject to medical treatment. And I apologize that apparently there's still some issues with the data entry here in Sefaria, because those aren't my typos for a change, those are Sefaria's. But what Rashbam is saying is that understand that chapter 13 onward, where we talk about this issue of Tzara'at in all of its many forms, is not talking about a medical condition. It is not talking about any skin disease that we are familiar with. And by the time we reach Rashbam, we're talking 1800 years ago. Sorry, we're talking like 800 years ago, 900 years ago. So even that long ago, they already recognized, and indeed it was known well before that there was no normal biological situation that is Tzara'at. They know of skin diseases and other types of issues, and they also know that those are not Tzara'at. For one, they don't match it perfectly, and for two, they do not, they do, meaning the ones that they are familiar with, respond to medical treatment. So if it responds to medical treatment, then it cannot be Tzara'at, because Tzara'at is something that responds only to the biblically prescribed instructions for its resolution. As he goes on to explain, what applies to the human skin applies in the same degree to stains on clothing, which are described here, as well as to manifestations of mildew or something similar breaking forth from the walls of the houses. The only criteria which we can apply to what is spelled out in these chapters, 12 to 15, are those laid down by our sages, the Midrash, the Talmud, etc., all of which date back to the instructions received orally from Moses. So you may think that you have some brilliant insight in the treatment of Tzara'at, and you're going to sell special lotions for its treatment. Don't. That is not what we need. There is no new insight waiting to be discovered for the treatment of Tzara'at, and for then to get FDA approval and start selling it. Tzara'at is not a condition that we are currently afflicted with, and the conditions we are afflicted with can be treated according to medical means. If you wish to become a research doctor, by all means, please do, and thank God that we have so many people working to try and cure diseases. But if you're going to offer a new ritual insight into how to treat Tzara'at, please stop, please stop, please stop. reflect instead on the statements of our sages and recognize that we are not currently dealing with Sura'at as a concern in our world, and we have not for more than 1,000 years. Okay, with that in mind, let's actually read a little bit about the Sura'at text, and we've got 20 minutes left. We'll see how far we can get. Just get Rashbam down a bit. Adonai spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, any person, when there is on the skin of his body is swelling or a scab or a shiny spot, and it becomes on the skin of his body an affliction of Sura'at, he is to be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons the priests. The priest is to look at the affliction of the skin of the flesh. Should hair in the afflicted area have turned white, and the look of the affliction is deeper than the skin of his flesh, it is an affliction of Sura'at. The priest is to look at it and is to declare him tameh, ritually impure. Now, if it is a white spot on the skin of his flesh, and deeper its look is not that of skin, and the hair has not turned white, the priest is to shut up the afflicted one for 7 days. There's a period of isolation. The priest is to look at him on the 7th day. And here, should the affliction be at a standstill in his eyes, the affliction not spread on the skin, the priest is to shut him up for 7 days a second time. The priest is to look at him on the 7th day a second time, and here should the affliction have faded, and the affliction has not spread on the skin, the priest is to declare him pure, to make him tahor. It is only a scab. When he scrubs his garments, he is pure. So we'll pause there to catch up with commentary and see how far we can get. But you'll notice the basic ideas are that when a person comes with this unusual discoloration of the skin, that the Kohen will examine the skin, the blemish itself, the skin itself, the hair that might be in it, and put them under observation if it is not clear at the beginning. And that observation can yield 2 results. One, the person might be ritually impure and indeed be suffering from Sura'at, or it could turn out to be a false alarm, and they are not suffering from Sura'at, even though they do have a very unsightly, perhaps, and also uncomfortable skin problem. So those are the resolutions that are potentially available. Let's go back up to our start so we can read along with our commentaries now, beginning with Rashbam. According to tradition, a reference to a skin irregularity on the skin of surrounding of the beard or the head. The Torah had to use the expression. So he's trying to say that this idea of this, it's a affliction that is in his flesh, in his skin. What does that mean for the skin of his body? This is an awkward phrasing. It's just a reference for anything that is around the beard or head, that is the usual expression that would be expected. And then talking about this here is swelling in Fox's translation. This is to describe, excuse me. This is to describe an elevation of the skin in the area afflicted. This is not an actual elevation, not an actual swelling, but an optical impression. That is, it is not as white as, for instance, as other types of skin blemishes. We know that those other types of blemishes represent the highest, purest degree of the color white. This is clear from the book of Job, although it is brilliantly bright in the sky, using that same root word. This color is described as 8. It is somewhat of a deeper color, in the sense of a lower degree of brightness or whiteness, the most brilliant kind of white. So he's trying to say that this idea of a swelling, not so much that it's swelling as it stands out. It doesn't have to be necessarily raised. It doesn't have to necessarily be up. It just has to stand out from the skin around, even if it is not the brightest of bright colors. And then as he goes on to talk about the sapachat, this is a word that is subordinate to tse'et, meaning that it is connected to it, or it is subordinate to the word baheret, the other term here for the shininess. And this is based on Samuel 1:22-36. Please assign me to one of the priestly duties. And that first word there is connected to our sapachat. Clearly, the word is used in a subordinate mode. we don't need to go into that too much, perhaps. And let's just go on with his final comment. The area where the affliction surfaces is white skin, as we know from Exodus 4:6, encrusted with snowy white scales, when God was teaching Moses some of the signs that he would demonstrate to convince Pharaoh. As we know, snow is white. So this is his basic understanding of it. Rashi, on the other hand, talking again about our swellings or the scabs or the other issues. These are the names of leprous plagues: the rising, scab, etc., AIDS, pachat, aheret. And they are the one whiter than the other. So like Rashbam, he agrees that this is a scale, seeing the sapachat as being its own category, and each one of them being more and more luminous in the whiteness of the skin color. We don't need to go in too much about the Old French. Instead, we'll talk about being brought to Aaron, that this is an enactment of scripture, that the uncleanness and purification of leprous plagues, of tzara'at, are pronounced only by the mouth of a priest. Very important point, that even if you think it is tzara'at, even if your neighbor thinks it's tzara'at, it's not tzara'at until the priest declares it as tzara'at. So this is, again, a very strong separation between this condition and a medical condition. If I think I've got the flu, if my friend thinks I've got the flu, it's probably the flu. And if I go to the doctor and say it's the flu, and he says it's the flu, well, then it probably has always been flu the entire time. Tzara'at only officially becomes tzara'at from the declaration of the priest, regardless of how confident the rest of us may be that we can identify and designate it as such. Okay, continuing on with verse number 3. Let's get that lined up. Come on, you're not getting me a little more granularity? That's, I guess, all right. Oh, and Rashbam is just talking a little bit more about the whiteness, but Rashi has more to say here, talking about this issue of the hair color turning to white. This means that at first it was dark and it turned white within the plague. The smallest number of hairs implied by the term se'ar is 2. So we need to have hairs that are being turned. There needs to be more than one, and that means we have at least 2, and it has to have not been white at the start. So if there was something on my arm, and I don't have any gray arm hairs yet, but if it was on my my beard, if I already had gray hair there, and then there was the blotch around it, the fact that those hairs are white is not indicative of anything, because they were already white. So that's the differentiation that Rashi is trying to give for us here. And then as he goes on to talk about the looking deeper than the skin, every white color is deep, in contrast to a dark color surrounding it, just as the color of anything illuminated by the sun is deeper than the shadow. And here you can see the deepness they're talking about is not a deepness in sort of a modern color language in English, but in terms of the intensity, the purity of the color. And certainly, as he points out, anything that is brightly illuminated is always going to have a greater intensity than something that is in the shadow. And that's what's being described here as being a deeper look, that it has to do with this intensity of the color. And he shall pronounce him unclean. He, again, the priest, shall say to him, you are unclean. For it is an enactment of scripture that hair that has become white is a symptom of uncleanness. And again, you'll notice this repetition. This is the enactment. This is what was given to us by Moses. This is what we have from Sinai. He is not resting on medical understanding here. It is just, this is what we're told, so this is how we will handle it. Now, verse 4, we get a very interesting statement by Rashi, which we will start off with. And he is commenting on this idea of its appearance being not deeper than the skin. And Rashi explains, I do not know the meaning of this. Lo yadati. Right? Lo yadati. I don't know. Right? Perusho, I don't know its interpretation. And I'll tell you, every now and then when Rashi says things like this, it is very reassuring to me. Sometimes when you read through a commentary, it seems so clear that the commentator knows everything, that this is all perfectly clear, transparent to them, that there's no confusion, no questions that are left over. It is all certain and certain as certain can be. And then Rashi comes along and says, you know what, actually, I don't know what this means. I'm not sure how to explain this. What does it mean to have its appearance not be deeper than the skin? Like, how would you even notice it then? What would that mean if it's not deeper than the skin? It doesn't make sense. I mean, that seems to be Rashi's confusion on this point. And he doesn't have a received tradition which explains what that means. And so he just says, yeah, this is confusing, and I don't know exactly what this would look like. I cannot tell you in words how to understand that phrase. Rashbam, his grandson, on the other hand, comes to that same verse, that same part of the same verse, and says, it is not the same kind of white as the other kinds of scales on the skin mentioned so far. So he says it's not about its relativeness to the skin per se, it's about its relative whiteness and intensity to the other types of blemishes that we've been talking about. And that's how you should interpret it. Now, is Rashbam right? I don't know. He might be, absolutely. But look at what Rashbam is doing here. And again, one of the reasons I picked Rashbam and Rashi is that they both had somewhat similar goals, but also that they were very similar in location and in time. Rashbam is Rashi's grandson. So for Rashbam to come and say, my grandfather didn't understand this, but I think I do, is again a very, very powerful statement. It is wonderful to be able to see that Rashi is stumped every now and then. It is also wonderful to see that people who come later can sometimes have insights and interpretations that were not available to the generations that preceded them, and we are okay with that. We do not need to only read the oldest layer of interpretation to know the truest ideas. That sometimes we need to have a building of different information, different insights that will eventually yield the aha moment that in Rashbam's mind gave him the capacity to make a comment here, even where his grandfather didn't. And while we do respect and turn to the previous generations with great reverence and with great deference, we also recognize that just as the Babylonian Talmud replaced the Jerusalem Talmud with its insights because it was published later and thus was able to build off the Jerusalem Talmud in its own analysis, so too we should not be surprised, and we should appreciate that later commentaries can sometimes offer an insight that was simply unavailable to earlier people who lacked that same exposure to the range of ideas which generated the new explanation. And like I said, personally, I find that very reassuring. Let's go ahead and finish off verse 4 in Rashi, though, where he talks about the isolation. He shall shut him up in one house and shall not see him again until the end of the week. That's what isolation means. Then the symptom that show themselves shall decide regarding him whether he is unclean or not. So this isolation is not I'm going to check on you daily and we'll decide it along the way. It takes a full 7-day cycle before we can make that consequence. Okay. We are just looking at our verses and our commentary here. We're going to go ahead and pause here. This concept of tzara'at, of this spiritual, physical affliction, is still one that I think all of us wrestle with in the modern world, partly because it's a little unclear exactly what it looked like and how it worked, what was exactly the course of its affliction for the people involved, but partly also because we are distant from the concepts of a spiritual problem having a physical manifestation. And I just want to use the last couple minutes to comment on that, because that should not be as big of a problem for us as it often is when I'm talking to people on these topics. The idea that the stress that we feel, the guilt that we can feel if we've done something wrong, or the turmoil that can be in our spirit for any number of reasons, it should not come as a surprise that that can manifest itself in very real, very tangible, and very debilitating physical ways. The number of people who can have a heart attack or who can have a terrible gastrointestinal problems, who can have problems such as depression, which have physical manifestations as well. There are so many ways that our spirit can create a physical issue for us, that this should not seem that strange. Is it starker? Yes. Is it something that is of a very distinct version that we are not familiar with personally? Yes. But the fact that I'm not familiar with it personally, because Tzara'at has not been operative for 1,000-year plus, doesn't mean that I can't at least understand the concept of this happening. So just, take care of yourself, and not only your body, take care of your spirit as well. We may not be suffering from the potential of Tzara'at in the modern world, but there are still ways that leaving our spirit untended to can create physical problems for us. So do take good care of both your nefesh and your guf, both your spirit and your body, and hopefully you'll be able to avoid any of those types of problems, or at least mitigate them and find healing.